But when you imbue coincidences with meaning, they come alive magically and they have you relate to them differently, which I believe has a more generative effect. It casts more seeds in and of itself. So the mode of engagement, that magical mode of engagement, is really important. Hey there, this is obviously James Tripp, and this is a live stream that nobody is live on yet. But I'm making this because I received a request from my friend Dipti Tate. Now, Dipti sent me a bunch of questions and a request. The request is, it says, James, I have a strange request, and it's for my abundance circle. I would absolutely love it if you can make a short video for our circle about manifesting. Let me turn the brightness up on this. We both know it's not magic. We both know it involves hard work. We both know how to get others to grow. What I want to know from you is this. And then the questions come. So, okay, I'm going to dive in and answer these questions. This video is sponsored by Hemispheres One, The Magician's Journey. This is a 6-month small group transformative program focusing on inside-out results creation, facilitated by me, James Tripp. It's by application only, and if you're interested, click through on the link. I might reflect on the broader message as well, as in we both know that it's not magic and these sorts of things, because, well, I don't know. It depends on your definition of magic, doesn't it, really? So first things first, this is for Dipti's Abundance Circle, and it's this term manifesting. I want to say something about this. I'm answering these questions straight, but manifesting is not a word that is a regular participant in my vocabulary. So I don't really use that term manifesting. I am very interested in what I call modes of non-linear generative engagement, how we can engage with the world in ways that are generative and creative, and non-linear, i.e. not just simply, okay, here's where I need to get to, so first step is this, second step is that, third step is that. So I do have an interest in these things, but manifesting is not a term that I generally use. Now, the term manifesting is interesting because when you do engage with the world in this non-linear generative way, the way that accords with the statement from Steve Jobs, you cannot connect the dots looking forward, only looking backwards. Sometimes magical things seem to happen. Things can seem to appear. It's like, well, look at this. Suddenly this opportunity is unfolded. And it can seem magical because it is non-linear, because it is not easy to track in that way. There's a metaphor that I often use that comes from an old mentor of mine, Steve Chandler, that goes like this. You know, a lot of people operate by the coffee machine model of the universe. So with the coffee machine model of the universe, if you're going to get a coffee from a coffee machine, you look to see what the coffee options are, you see the number, you put the amount of money in required, you press the button, the cup drops down, the coffee comes out. It's all linear. Now, life is rich and life is complex, so attempting to engage with complexity in a linear way, you create a mismatch, and it often doesn't work that well, which is why when people try to create only linearly, they can be productive, but they usually get into a sort of a struggle. Most things that they produce will often come in late and less than what they perhaps were intended to be. But unless somebody opens up the bandwidth and exposes themselves to more of that complexity and exposes themselves to possibility and serendipity and all of these sorts of things, what gets produced is never surprising. Okay, so it's never really creative, it is merely productive. So I'm interested in these non-linear modes of engagement with the world. I'm interested in exposing ourselves to serendipity and allowing things to come through. So unlike the coffee machine model of the universe, this is much more akin to living life by standing on the banks of a river and casting seeds into that river. Now, these seeds that you cast, they wash down the river and you don't necessarily know where they wash up. But as you move forward in life, you suddenly find yourself surrounded by a greater abundance of fruit trees because of the seeds that have been cast. And you never really necessarily know which of the seeds led to which fruit tree, or even if that fruit tree grew from one of your seeds. But if you cast the seeds, well, what happens is things start to grow around you. So this is my approach to what you might call manifesting, even though it's not a term that I would generally use. So I'm going to answer Dipti's questions on this straight up. Okay, so the first question is, when did you realize you were magical? Okay, when did you realize you're magical? Now, I suspect Dipti's asking this question because I talk a lot about magic. I have an interest in magic. I think magic, sometimes in more formal senses, is a useful tool for unlocking brain systems that might normally be offline, for enabling us to make different connections and to engage with the world with a looser grip, so to speak, instead of being tightly focused on those outcomes, to approach things in more peripheral ways. So I place a lot of value in magic in that sense, and I do things that I would describe as magic. So for example, I will begin my day very often by magically priming myself, because I'm aware that my state and mode of engagement with the world is more important than the plans that I am making and the linear sequences and the to-do lists and all of these sorts of things. So I kind of magically prime myself. I also choose to recognize or acknowledge synchronicities. Now, a synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. People who are very rational, analytic, enamored of Enlightenment values only will often dismiss such things as not being meaningful coincidences, as being merely coincidences. But when you imbue coincidences with meaning, they come alive magically, and they have you relate to them differently, which I believe has a more generative effect. It casts more seeds in and of itself. So the mode of engagement, that magical mode of engagement, is really important. I also believe that there is, I hate to say this, there's a functionality to engaging with the world in magical ways. And the reason that I hate to say this is the whole notion of functionality is a kind of like, is a very, in a sense, it kind of kills the magic, because there are other values that need to come into the mix to live magically and get results other than functionality. It's like if you're obsessed with the function, if you're obsessed with the outcome, what you're missing is everything else that adds richness that is likely to lead to that outcome anyway. What I'm talking about there is, instead of function, I'm talking about aesthetics. You know, for a long time, my battle cry was, is it useful, rather than is it true? I'm going to do another video about this, by the way, upgrading from is it true to is it useful. But then what is everything beyond that? Is it beautiful? Is it aesthetic? Is it spiritual? Is it heroic? Is it what, right? What else can we engage with? And how does that transform our own consciousness and our own being in the world, which in turn always changes the results that you get? So I have an interest in stuff that I tend to call magical. Now, by magical, so Dipti is saying we know it's not magical. For me, stuff is magical. It is magic, but that doesn't mean it's supernatural. Okay, there's the Hamlet line, isn't there? There are more things on heaven and earth than your philosophy accounts for, Horatio, or something like that is the line. So I don't think the world is necessarily full of supernatural entities. I mean, to me, that doesn't make any sense. Nature is nature. Nature is what is. But nature and life and psychosocial life, particularly that we create as human beings, cultural life, is so phenomenally complex. It's not any more complex than we think, it's more complex than we can think. So we need to have non-linear modes of engagement if we're really going to dance results out of reality. And that's a term that I use, by the way. I've said this before, magic is dancing results out of reality, rather than getting in the linear grind through. And when you dance results out of reality and those results are surprising, this is when it seems magical. And I think there's some real value in engaging with it through magical consciousness. For me, that's a particular type of consciousness with a particular type of phenomenology to it. And I'm not saying that that type of consciousness is the type of consciousness you want to be bound by at all times in life. I think there's a lot of value in a rational analytic consciousness. But if you're stuck in that, that has its downsides. If you can do rational analytic consciousness, and you can do magical consciousness, and you can do mythical consciousness, and you can do all sorts of forms of consciousness, I'm abusing ideas from Jean Yebse there, and I'm aware that I'm abusing them. But if you can do these different forms of consciousness, you have flexibility. So there's a problem when people get trapped in magical consciousness. There's a problem when people get trapped in rational analytic consciousness. These different modes of engagement produce different kinds of results from life. I'm going to back up actually onto what Dipti said here. We both know that it's not magic. We both know that it involves hard work. I'm not interested in hard work, I'll admit that. Now by that doesn't mean I expect things to come to me easily, but I don't want the work to be hard. If it's hard, for me, it's not magical. Okay, I'm just back in the linear. I'm back in the grind through. I'm back in efforting. This sort of thing. Efforting for me is not magical. It's quite the opposite. So I would say it involves engagement rather than hard work. It involves a mode of engagement. This is what I'm very interested about. And you'll note that phrase that I used earlier, non-linear generative engagement. You have to be engaged. You cannot be disengaged. You have to be engaged in order to create. But for me, if it's hard work, then it's not magical. I am in the linear, I am in the grind through, I'm in the efforting. So it's not hard work. And I know I don't want to be picking on what Dipti is saying, because I think what Dipti is wanting to say there, and I'm guessing this, is that a lot of people do think, they've read The Secret or something, and they think they could just do a quick vision board and kick back and it's all good, right? But that's not engaging, that's disengaging. So there is a mode of engagement that is required for this. So I'm semi-disagreeing with Dipti, but this is probably on just a semantic level, that I think it is magic, but not supernatural. And I don't want stuff to involve hard work for me. I want it to involve generative engagement, which actually is very enlivening, although can also take quite a lot out of me. I'll admit that I need downtime as well from doing this stuff. So when did you realize that you were magical? This is a really interesting question. I don't know is the answer, but I can answer with something similar. I have had a long and strange relationship with the magical, which I guess goes back to childhood in a lot of ways. I had a lot of night terrors as a child. And basically what that meant for me is I would go to bed at night and I would have a very, very vivid dream, which I would wake up from and then continue to hallucinate and project the content of that dream onto the world around me. And I would do this regularly, several times a week for a long time. I think it was quite disturbing for my parents. It was certainly disturbing for me. Now, I'm not saying that means anything about anything, but in a sense, back then, I was living in a horrific but very magical consciousness. These things seemed real. They're very, very real as anything. When I would be hallucinating something, stood next to my parents who were trying to console me, or even a modification to them. I had one dream at one point where they had been killed by a thermonuclear device. And then when I awoke and they tried to comfort me because I was screaming, they appeared to me as literal zombies, which was quite terrifying, obviously. Now, this is the dark side of magical consciousness. I was kind of embedded in a magical consciousness here, but it was not functional. It was dysfunctional. It's a dysfunctional magical consciousness. It wasn't leading to enrichment or reward or anything like this. So it's kind of like had this capacity for magical consciousness at a young age, but it was not under my mastery, and it was not working in a useful kind of a way. So aside from that, as I got into my teens, I had a particular interest in magic and the supernatural and these sorts of things. I had a curiosity about it, and I felt drawn towards it. So when I was a teen, I was kind of like an in-betweener, in that I'd kind of hang out with the cool kids, but then I'd sneak off and play Dungeons and Dragons on the side. And when I played Dungeons and Dragons, I was always either a magician or an illusionist as a character, and never a warrior or anything like that. I didn't have the draw towards those sorts of things. And I also had a curiosity about psychic phenomena and stuff like this, and I got books on this, and I would explore with this in my teens. Now, to counter that, my father is an engineer, a very rationally minded individual, very, very rationally minded. So I had these sort of forces coming in, and suffice it to say that a rationally minded engineer doesn't think too much of the magical. So there were these kind of subtle forces at work at me that pushed that into my shadow side, pushed the magical into my shadow side. And it remained in my shadow side for a very, very long time. To the point where many years ago I trained in spiral dynamics with Chris Cowan. And anyone who knows spiral dynamics, there's the purple V-meme stuff. This is really about magical consciousness, purple V-meme. And you do this kind of profiling thing, and it would come up that you would have affinities for certain values memes and rejections of certain values memes. And I had the strongest psychological rejection for purple V-meme. This is the magical. Now, I would have been, I don't know, in my 30s at that point. And well exposed to NLP, by the way, well into NLP. But of course, NLP was appealing to me because it was about the structure of magic. It's about making magic rational in so many ways. So it kind of, but it's always been there in the background. There's other stories I tell about how when I was in my teens, and I only got back to this doing a bit of sort of pseudo-Jungian stuff later on, I'd created this character in my teens that I intended to have as a comic book character called the Street Shaman. And I drew up the Street Shaman and this kind of thing, and I actually dressed like the Street Shaman. Now, I never told anyone this. This was an internal mythology I started to create, but I just sort of dismissed it as just imagination and that sort of thing. But later on, I sort of revisited and started bringing elements through. And I think when I started to bring elements of this Street Shaman through, that I created quietly and privately in my teens, and then repressed for a long time, and started to allow to come through, I don't know when, late 30s, maybe like 5-6 years ago, I don't know. So I start to allow this to come through. And, this kind of like journey back towards the magical, back to engaging with things magically, back to valuing magical consciousness, whilst also being aware of the downsides of magical consciousness. Very, very often people look at things as good versus bad. So I've been on a journey back for a long time into being able to have this connection into magical ways of being and magical ways of doing, but have them serve me to be the master of those ways of being and doing. That's kind of where I'm at with magic and this kind of thing. I'll just say a couple of other things about magic and the magical. Because if you don't like the term magic, if that's too strong, think about things in terms of the magical as in a quality and a magical style of engagement with things. That might be more useful for people. I've often said to people I'm a recovering logician. So I did a philosophy degree in the Western analytic tradition. That means that it was all about logic and dissection and reason and these sorts of things. So that part of me is well developed and it has served me well. I appreciate it. I also see its downsides very strongly as well. So I like to keep that in the mix, but I do value it. And what I'm saying is, one of the things that's often kept me away from the sort of magical end of things, or woo-woo. I was just having a conversation with somebody this morning who said something was a bit woo-woo. I do have a kind of tendency to pull away from the woo-woo, or at least I think I do. Some people probably think I'm very woo-woo, because often in the woo-woo world, if there is such a thing, there is a lack of discernment in thinking, right? So people often let themselves get taken by a magical consciousness, but there's nothing to counterbalance it. Okay, it's all yang and no yin, or all yin and no yang, depending on how you look at it. There's no counterbalancing measure in the mix. And I do think like a magical consciousness has wonder and possibility within it. It has a lot of dark sides to it as well. Even if somebody's not experiencing it as dark, it can end up getting people trapped in reality tunnels that they're not questioning, that may not be serving them. I was saying to a friend of mine yesterday, what's the difference between enchantment and curse? You know, an enchantment and a curse. If a person was cursed and they thought they were enchanted, what would be the implications of that? Because you can get that. You can have somebody who's in a worldview or in a trance or a reality tunnel that to them seems like they are enlightened, but they can actually be trapped in a place that's actually reducing their power and impact in the world. I've seen this a lot. They're cursed, I would say, my judgment is they're cursed, but they think they're enchanted. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff in the mix. And I think if you bring discernment in your thinking to magical consciousness, these sorts of things, I think you can truly become the master of this stuff and have it work for you and avoid some of the pitfalls that can be in the mix. For the unwary and for the undiscerning thinker. So when did you realize you're magical? I don't know. At some point it emerged. It's floated in and floated out. And it's more about, for me, an appreciation of the magical. And then what happened next? So what happened next is always happening. It's always happening. I suppose if there's anything I'm dedicated to in life, I'm dedicated to personal evolution of self, the evolution of my consciousness, or I consider it the evolution, that's a metaphor. The modification of my consciousness and the evaluation of those modifications as it relates to how that consciousness engages with the world, how it keys into the world and creates with the world around me. So what's ongoing for me is just a continual exploration of what's beyond what I think I know that might be interesting and might be useful. So I'm constantly gearing into this. The truth of the matter is this, is some people are wildly and phenomenally good at having things show up in their lives in apparently effortless ways. We're talking about manifestation here. And I can be quite good at doing this as well, but I'm often not. So for me, it's work, right? It's like lucid dreaming. If you are in a dream, most of the time people are not lucid when they're in a dream. They're taken by the dream. They're not lucid. But when you become lucid, you recognize that you're in a dream and there are certain things that you can manipulate, okay? But what often happens for people is they go lucid in a dream and then they lose the lucidity. Or they go lucid for a bit, then they wake up from the dream. It's one thing to go lucid in a dream, it's another thing to stay lucid before being pulled back into the dream. Now, in life, we can go lucid. We can suddenly see things instead of being pulled into a default trance or a default mode of engagement. We can go lucid and become aware of something else, other possibilities, other ways of engaging. But staying lucid is another trick, because to do magic consistently, to live magically consistently, it means breaking with consensus reality on a regular basis. Okay, the collective trance, consensus reality. And that collective trance, it pulls on us all the time, outside of consciousness. It pulls on me, right? So there is, we live in a world that is hugely shaped by rational enlightenment values the modern thinker, and then the postmodern, which is an application of these sort of rational analytic tools back upon themselves. It's to the point where everything kind of dissolves and falls apart. So we live in a particular consciousness, and it's not an especially magical consciousness at the moment. So for me, there's the ongoing developmental path of developing my lucidity to step away from consensus reality and create in realms that are outside of that. That is the ongoing pathway for me, and I get better and better at doing it, and I kind of roll in and I roll out, but it's an interesting path nonetheless. So that's what happens next for me. I'm going to look at some of the things that are being mentioned here. So Darren is saying, awareness that it's magic gives you access to always knowing you can switch your lanes immediately if you are willing to. I'm going to do this thing where I stab on the see more bit, and eventually it sometimes opens up. It's wonderful. How can this be so hard? How can I not simply manifest Darren's? There we go, finally. So, awareness that it's magic gives you access to always knowing you can switch your lanes immediately if you're willing to let go of the dream where necessary. Yeah, so it's grounding in that, right? Here's a thing for me about magic. I go through phases of being extremely magical in my engagement with the world, extremely non-linear, all about casting the seeds, all about appreciating the synchronicities, all about dancing results out of reality, as I put it. And it's great. And I get all this evidence come in that it works really, really well, right? And this is one of the reasons that I know that my rational mind isn't that rational. Everybody thinks their rational modes of engagement are rational, right? And they're not. They're just biased. You see, all the rational mind does is works with what it's already established as fact, and then manipulates what it's already established as fact to make sense of anything new. And it doesn't like to readapt necessarily. It doesn't work with pure reason in relation to evidence. So what I tend to find is I'll go through periods of time where I am creating magically, so to speak, and I'm loving it and I'm getting great results. And then at some point I lose my lucidity and I get back into what I would call the grind through, the linear mode, the A then B then C. The thing that we're taught to do is pick your outcome, look at the steps towards it. I find myself back in it, back into efforting, these sorts of things. Why? Because I was raised in a reality tunnel that says this is the way the world works. I was raised in a schooling system that says this is the way the world works. The stuff, that's consensus reality. Efforting. Who doesn't have a to-do list? What productive person doesn't run to-do lists? What project manager doesn't run Gantt charts? Right? I can tell you, when they built the pyramids, they had no Gantt charts. So the consensus reality, the pull is always there for me, and that's what I'm looking at to get back on the path. And the way I see things developing across time for me, projecting forward, is the more that magical side is able to come alive and remain dominant, and the more the conditioned me deconditions. And that's an ongoing process. This is one of the reasons I love developmental work, by the way. I do developmental coaching. I've had colleagues in the world of hypnotherapy saying, James, why do you bother with developmental coaching? Hypnosis is wonderful. You can make any change that you want in 15 minutes. Yeah, but development is incremental. There's an old saying, you can't get there from here. Okay, so the very questions you're going to ask next about where you want to go next are dependent upon where you are. So you can't magically jump forward in time through multiple levels of personal evolution. So this is why I'm very much into developmental work and not just simple, okay, let's change that and now you're all fixed and your life is absolutely perfect. So I value hypnosis in a context of developmental work, and I value hypnosis for helping people make small, simple changes, but it cannot replace developmental work in order to get the kind of results that you might want to get from that. So if you're looking to transform yourself and your ways of being in the world, if you're looking to really evolve your consciousness, there is no way around doing the developmental work. I'm just going to dive in here and do some more screen stabbing because Darren's said something else that I might want to address. Darren's saying, I take a break from creating magic. Sometimes I need a full month of not trying to manifest stuff. Darren's got a point here. It does not pay to get caught in one mode of engagement with the world ever. All right? It doesn't. It tends to be unhealthy. We need variety in our lives, I believe, as human beings. This is a basic form of psychological nutrition for us, variety. So to get stuck in one mode of mind isn't good. Personally, for me, and this relates to kind of manifesting and magic and all of this, I am much more influenced by pre-Socratic philosophy and by Taoism and these sorts of things that see the world as a dynamic, adaptive place, that don't have these ideas, these Platonic ideas that there's an ideal, unchanging form of things that is somehow superior to the shadowy world around us. I don't buy that. Not a fan of Plato. Okay? So to me, life is dynamic. It's unfolding. It's moving. It's always dancing. It's always cascading. So there's no fixed point at which you get to go, this is the right way to be. That's the right way to be. I often mention yin and yang because I come from a Taoist. Taoism is a huge influence on me. And people say, oh yeah, balance. That's the first word they talk about when they hear yin and yang. I hear it so often. Oh yeah, you've got to get the balance between yin and yang. Yin and yang theory has never been about balance. It is not about balance. Somebody likes that. I'm seeing some loves popping up. Yin and yang is about interplay, not balance. Interplay. This is a very, very different thing. Interplay. I wish the world would get this, right? Out there, everyone's divided all the time. They connect into their tribes. I'm a right wing, I'm left wing, whatever it is. No one actually identifies as that, but they unconsciously pick their position. And then they're going, well, which one is right? This one or that one? And somebody else might say, we need a balance. We need to be centrist. It's interplay. Which direction do we need to move next? How do we need to lean now? If you're sailing a yacht, right, and you're leaning out, you don't spend the whole yacht journey leaning out one way. You lean out this way and then the wind changes and you have to lean out the other way. It's interplay. So Darren, I'm totally resonant with what Darren's saying here. If you decide like one mode of mind is the right way to engage with the world and you keep leaning into that, it's going to stop paying dividends after a bit. And you need to lean the other way for a bit. So this is the same with magical consciousness versus rational analytic consciousness. I see people out there all the time debating. People going, oh, you're just had by the religion of scientism, So you get magical thinkers bashing scientific thinkers. You get scientific thinkers bashing magical thinkers. It isn't even about balance. It's about the capacity to work the interplay of those things. And this is a huge thing, by the way. I'm going on another rant at this point because I mentioned before about global consciousness and where global consciousness is at. And my personal belief is the most useful thing that could happen in terms of global consciousness right now is the ability for people to really get this idea of interplay. Right? You see it out there. You see people squabbling, the maskers versus the anti-maskers, the Brexiteers versus the anti-Brexiteers, this faction versus that faction. Nobody stops and looks deeper into the other person's position, looks at the values, looks at the modes of mind, the modes of engagement that sit underneath the obvious issues, and look at how they may work in the broader dynamic of things. When is it useful to lean this way? When is it useful to lean that way? Everything is dynamic. The context is dynamic. I think the more that people can get this, the more they can start participating with others and participating with the world and generatively working forward. I know that's maybe people think that that's unrealistic thinking, but ultimately global consciousness is shaped by the ideas that flow through it. Consciousness has been very different globally than what it is today across time, and it can continue to evolve and grow and change. People don't understand consciousness. They think that they see the world roughly as it is, and maybe they think some different ideas about how the world is than other people do. But they don't get that consciousness itself is qualitatively very different depending upon how you render up the world. And that the way we experience the world at the moment is very different from how somebody in the 15th century would have done, or 2000 years BC would have done, or whatever. It's not literally, literally we'd experience the world differently and thus engage differently. This is why people can't figure out how the pyramids were built, because they don't understand the consciousness that the pyramids came from. They go, well, it must have been slaves. That's the only way that this pharaoh could have got their will. As if it was just about the will of the pharaoh rather than a collective consciousness of not even a nation. They wouldn't have seen themselves that way. Anyways, look, I'm going off-piste. I'm going way off-piste. I'll just say last thing about what Darren was saying. I went at one point into this uber magical consciousness space where I was engaged like every waking moment in magically creating, and it was phenomenally generative. A lot of stuff happened during that period. But I also convinced myself in that period that I could stay in that space and be superhuman. And what that meant is I took on absolutely tons and tons and tons of stuff. I said yes to everything. I was juggling 50,000 things because I bought into the reality that I was superhuman. And, well, my neurons started to want some downtime and started to complain. But I'd made all these commitments and I stuck in, and I basically bit off more than I could chew, and I ended up having a phase of reasonably significant burnout. There's some people that might be watching this live stream that remember that, because at one point I did a live training and people turned up and I think they could see I was pretty washed out. So I do really think it's important to not just get stuck in one mode of engagement the whole time, and to be able to sort of shift and transform about. So if you got something from this video, or even if you just enjoyed watching it, please do like the video, share with your friends, anybody who might benefit from this information. Also, if you have an interest in the nexus of mind and life and shaping your life from the inside out, subscribe to the channel, hit the notifications bell. That way you will be informed as to when new videos come out. And if you have any questions, make use of the comments section below, because that way this conversation can continue. This video is sponsored by Hemispheres One, The Magician's Journey. This is a 6-month small group transformative program focusing on inside-out results creation, facilitated by me, James Tripp. It's by application only, and if you're interested, click through on the link.